Hello, I'm Father Anthony Cicada, and welcome to broadcast number 7 for the Philothea Press bestseller, Work of Human Hands, A Theological Critique of the Mass of Paul VI, by the Reverend Anthony Cicada. To order Work of Human Hands and to read excerpts, visit www.philotheapress.com. Chapter 7, Art, Architecture, Furnishings, Ready for Assembly. As a seminarian in the early 1970s, I went to the dedication for a brand new church at a Benedictine abbey in the American Middle West. From the outside, it looked like an oddly shaped bunker. The inside featured clear glass windows, blond wood beams, bare concrete walls, a square table altar, and 2 images. The misshapen ping-pong paddle is the abbot's crozier. In the sacristy after the ceremony, the abbot, who had a reputation as a bit of a wit, thanked the archbishop and clergy who had participated, adding at the end of his remarks, "And if it fails as a church, it'll make a really great restaurant." We have all been in churches like this. Is it a church, or is it really a food court? I don't know about you, but the stained glass window looks an awful lot like Starbucks to me. Why do so many churches built for the Mass of Paul VI look so unchurchy? Why does the priest face the people now for Mass? Why did the tabernacle disappear? Why are there so few statues and images? The answer isn't fads or bad taste. It's bad theology. Specifically the modernist theology of the Mass as assembly. As we saw on broadcast 5, assembly theology was the underlying basis for the creation of the new Mass. Naturally, understanding the Mass primarily as an assembly supper rather than as a sacrifice offered to God will have a profound influence on the externals of the rite. Chapter 7 of Work of Human Hands examines how assembly theology affected the new legislation governing the externals of the Mass of Paul VI, church architecture, the altar, the tabernacle, and the rest. The 1969 General Instruction and the post-Vatican II Rite for the dedication of a church laid down the guiding principle. They prescribed that the plan of a church should convey the image of the gathered assembly. One of Bonini's collaborators, Father Alessandro Pistoia, wrote an extensive commentary on this shift of emphasis. The exaltation of the majesty of God, the glorification of the saints, and private devotion, he said, are no longer important considerations in the design of churches. The objective of the new liturgical environment, rather, is to promote a celebration in which the assembly actively participates. The basis for this, he said, is the whole rediscovered biblical liturgical theology of assembly. One of the most striking features of the post-Vatican II liturgical changes, and one intimately linked to assembly theology, was Mass celebrated facing the people, which was adopted everywhere after Vatican II. Father Jose Maria Martin Patino, who is a member of Concilium Study Group 10, was directly involved in creating the new order of Mass, pointed out this connection. The modern notion of Mass facing the people, he said, is based on an anthropocentric, or man-centered theology, rather than as before on a theocentric or God-centered theology. In recent years, some have begun to advocate celebrating the Mass of Paul VI in the old direction, facing east, or ad orientem, as they say. For the liturgy of the Word, the priest faces the people. For the liturgy of the Eucharist, he faces the altar with his back to the people, an arrangement that looks a little like the old Mass. The most prominent apologist for this if not the man who inspired the movement in the first place, was Joseph Cardinal Ratzinger, first in a 1981 article, and then in a book published in 2000. Christian liturgy, said Ratzinger, must be cosmic liturgy. Facing east makes this cosmic dimension of the Eucharist present through liturgical gesture. Facing the altar, he continued, was in reality expressing a view of the Eucharistic celebration in the context of cosmos and parousia. Cosmos, cosmic, sounds mystical and devotional, doesn't it? Since Ratzinger was permanently labeled the great watchdog of orthodoxy, one might think that such language was rooted in good old-fashioned traditional Catholic theology. In fact, however, Ratzinger lifted his cosmic terminology directly from two modernists. The first was Hans Urs von Balthasar, specifically his books Cosmic Liturgy and The Glory of the Lord. Due to the mystical tone, some would say the pseudo-mystical tone of his writings, Balthasar has become popular among conservatives who consider him quite traditional. In reality, though, Balthasar detested traditional Thomistic theology, which he said he felt like tearing down with Samson's own strength. Ratzinger's second source for cosmic was the works of Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, a Jesuit evolutionist silenced by the Holy Office in 1925 and thereafter forbidden to write. Teilhard's ideas on the cosmic Christ and the omega point of cosmic evolution enjoyed a great vogue for a while after Vatican II, and amounted to not so thinly veiled pantheism. It will come as a surprise to many to hear that Ratzinger has long been a promoter of this heretic. Indeed, as Benedict XVI, he has even worked Teilhard and Teilhardian terminology into his public discourses, as during this Vesper homily in Aosta, where he spoke of Teilhard's great vision, where, quote, at the end of time, we will have a true cosmic liturgy, where the cosmos becomes a living host. The movement to offer the Mass of Paul VI facing east, or ad orientem as they say, will of course appeal to many Catholics of a traditional bent. Hey, it sure looks like the old rite. But rather than from Trent and Thomism, it springs from the toxic Teilhard, adrift in his own theological cosmos. Before Vatican II, the Blessed Sacrament was reserved in a tabernacle on the high altar of nearly every Catholic church in the world. All that has changed. These days you never know where you'll find the tabernacle. The possibilities are endless. How did this come about? Vatican II prescribed a revision for church laws dealing with sacred art and furnishings, including the placement of the tabernacle. So, a series of post-Vatican II laws first forbade the celebration of Mass on an altar with a tabernacle, then removed the tabernacle from a prominent place in the sanctuary, and finally consigned it to a separate chapel. The Benedictine Abbey restaurant church we mentioned put the tabernacle in this little sacrament cave. The new legislation explained that the prohibition against celebrating Mass on an altar where the Blessed Sacrament was reserved was based, quote, on grounds of sign value, unquote, because Christ is present in the assembly, in Scripture, in the homily, in the minister, and only then under the Eucharistic elements. Modernist assembly theology, in other words, dictates the exile of the tabernacle. The same assembly theology behind the definition of the Mass in Article 7 of the 1969 General Instruction. Another notable feature of the reform was the hostility towards religious statues and images. Old churches were stripped of them, and new churches were built without them. Vatican II's Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy stated first that the practice of placing sacred images in churches for veneration by the faithful is to be maintained. But it added a second statement, which effectively negated the first. Nevertheless, there is to be restraint regarding their number and prominence, so that they do not create confusion among the Christian people or foster religious practices of doubtful orthodoxy. This passage contains 5 fuzzy or equivocal terms: restraint, number, prominence, confusion, and practices of doubtful orthodoxy. These terms raise more questions than they answer, and will be used to strip Catholic churches everywhere of statues and images. On the question of images, the 1969 General Instruction adds, "There is a need both to limit their number and to situate them in such a way that they do not distract the people's attention from the celebration." Bottom line, keep your eyes on that cantor lady, or get real used to looking at that bare wall. Talk about options. To find out more about the reasons behind the post-Vatican II changes in church art, architecture, and furnishings, read Ready for Assembly, Chapter 7 of Work of Human Hands, a theological critique of the Mass of Paul VI. Our next chapter, Meeting and Greeting. To order Work of Human Hands and to read excerpts, visit www.philotheapress.com.